Amen, and good morning to you. You might be looking at your watch thinking, oh, church is going to run late today, but what's late? I mean, we're not defined by time, but the good thing is there is a really good morning tea, so good things come to those who wait. So you will be blessed. Speaking of blessings, have you enjoyed this series, Questions Jesus Asked? Yeah, I'm really enjoying just listening to the messages. It's been such a privilege, really, to have the experience and the depth of people, the variety of people that have been preaching into this series, and there's still more to come, so hang around with us for the next few weeks as well. We are in week 5 of this 8-week series called Questions Jesus Asked, and in fact, if you look through the Gospels, you'll find, should you wish to do this one day when you've got a spare hour, you'll find approximately 300 questions that Jesus asked. And I know what you're thinking. I'm sure glad we're not covering them all, because we would be here till about 2029 if we did one per week. No, we've just selected 8. But the question that we are looking at this morning is, who touched my clothes? And up front you might be thinking, well, what kind of question is that? But in fact, it is a question that Jesus asked, and a story that's pretty familiar as well. And this question elicits a story of pain and a story of suffering. And that pain and suffering, in some ways, is not unlike what many of us here today are facing. We're going to look at the story of a woman who's grappling with some really significant burdens. The story centers around her, but of course, the main character is Jesus. And we're going to see that he responds to her pain and her suffering with compassion and with mercy. And so grab your Bible, your phone, your device, whatever it might be. We're finding ourselves this morning in the Gospel of Mark, looking at chapter 5, reading from verse 24. I'm going to walk through the passage as we unpack this a little bit this morning. But to give us just a little bit of context as you're turning there, what we find is that the gospel writer and the disciple Mark, he wants to put the power of Jesus and the compassion of Jesus on display over and over and over again. And if you do a quick flick through the Gospel of Mark, you'll see in chapter 4, Mark records this story where Jesus displays his power over the natural world. He calms the sea. In Mark 5, just before the story we're looking at today, Jesus displays his power over the demonic world. This morning we're going to see Jesus' display of power over sickness. And then the remainder of chapter 5, Jesus displays his power over death. Mark wants you to see something. He wants you to see that Jesus is in control. And we might struggle a little bit with that concept on the day-to-day. But Mark wants us to know, as he's recording the life and the ministry of Jesus, that time after time after time, Jesus demonstrates his supremacy, his control, his sovereignty, and he responds to people, to their pain and their suffering, with compassion. I am fully aware as we look at this passage that there are people in this room who perhaps might even find yourself in a similar situation to this woman this morning, in a place of pain and suffering. And I say that because I know some of your stories and some of the things that you're going through right now. And so before we get to the text, I just want you to think about a question in this moment. What is the greatest burden for you right now? What is your greatest burden right now, today? I believe that we all carry some sort of burden. For some of us, it could be obvious. It might be a diagnosis, or a physical ailment, a relationship that's broken. It might be something that we're struggling with emotionally. And for some of us, perhaps even as I ask that question, you can identify something straight away because you know your burden intimately. You have walked with your burden for such a long time. Perhaps for others of you, though, You haven't really thought about it. And in fact, right now is just a really good season of life. Things are going well. I want to say to you, I want to promise you that even in the seasons of life where it seems everything is going great, we still carry burdens. And the beautiful thing that we see again today is that Jesus is in the business of restoring our brokenness. He takes our burdens onto himself if we allow him to, and makes us whole. So let's have a look at the text. And with that said, the story is about much more than just a physical healing today. We are going to read about a physical healing, but this is also about a holistic healing. Mark 5, starting at verse 24. It says, "He went off with him, and a large crowd was following him and pressing in on him." I guess we kind of have to understand who the he's and the hims are before we get going. The he is capitalized, so we know that this is talking about Jesus. In fact, your translation might say Jesus went off with him. And to find out who Jesus has gone off with, we've got to go back a couple of verses. There's this guy named Jairus. He's a synagogue official. He's a ruler in the Jewish world. He's got money, he's got power, he's got fame. He's a man of really great importance. And Jairus had heard that Jesus was doing all of these things, these miracles in and around the area. And so he comes to Jesus and he starts pleading with Jesus. He's like, "Jesus, I need you. I need you to come with me because my daughter, who is 12 years old, is on her deathbed." Any parent here today with a child in that situation would feel the weight of this. And so Jesus goes off with this rich, powerful, wealthy man. And as he's going from one place to another, as often happened with Jesus, he's met by a large crowd of people. You see, Jesus was starting to become famous. You could easily see why. He's healing people. They've heard about his greatness. They heard about his abilities. His celebrity is growing. And so as he's walking, the crowds are starting to press in on him and they just want to be around him. If they could just walk with him or touch him or experience a glimpse of his greatness. But there was one person, one woman, who was very different from all the rest in the crowd that day. Verse 25 says, "A woman in the crowd had suffered from a hemorrhage for 12 years and had endured much suffering at the hands of many physicians. She had spent all that she had and was not helped at all, but instead had become worse." 12 years. 12 years of bleeding and suffering, 12 years of pain. I just want us to put ourselves in her suffering just for a moment. Now, I know that there are some people here and you have physical pain. Even right now, it pains in your body. You have a pain physically to sit on this chair and be here this morning. Every day for 12 years, this woman woke up with pain in her body. Now, I don't want to speak for all the men in the room, but honestly, by about day 2 of the man flu, I'm like, I'm ready to die. Just, Jesus, take me home. I cannot imagine 12 years of pain. And this illness presented many more problems, in fact, than just the physical response of her body. You see, back in Leviticus 15, we see the laws regarding bodily emissions, both for men and for women. I don't need you to turn to it, but I want to read it to you because we need to understand what is going on for this woman and what's been going on for 12 years. This is what it says. "When a woman has a discharge, if her bodily discharge is blood, she shall continue in her menstrual impurity for 7 days, and whoever touches her shall be unclean until evening. Everything on which she lies during her menstrual impurity shall be unclean. Everything on which she sits shall be unclean. Anyone who touches her bed shall wash his clothes and bathe in water and be unclean until evening. Whoever touches anything on her which she sits on shall wash his clothes and bathe in water and be unclean until evening. And if it is on her bed, or if on the thing which she is sitting when he touches it, he shall be unclean until evening. If a man lies with her so that her menstrual impurity is on him, he shall be unclean for 7 days, and every bed on which he lies shall be unclean. Now, if a woman has a flow of blood for many days, not during her time of menstruation, that is what the case of this woman in Mark 5. Or if she has a discharge beyond that period, as long as the impure discharge continues, she shall be as it is in the days of her menstrual impurity. And here's how it ends: she is unclean. Aren't you glad we live on this side of the cross, ladies, in the new covenant? There is a theme here. The theme is that because of her bleeding, she's unclean for the entire time that she is bleeding, and then 7 days after. Anything that she touches, anyone that she touches also becomes unclean. And this has been her life for 12 years. She's in physical pain and she's emotionally crushed. 12 years of feeling less than. 12 years of people looking down on her for something she had no control over. 12 years wondering if anyone cares about me. Not only is she emotionally crushed, she's relationally starved. She can't touch anyone and no one can touch her. No one has hugged this woman for 12 years. She can't even be around people because if someone accidentally touches her, they're unclean. Do you remember COVID? That little thing a couple of years back? I mean, in the height of COVID here in Brisbane, we had it pretty good. We were quarantined for what, like a couple of months? I know, the introverts, you're like, oh, that was amazing. But for the rest of us, we're like, I just need people. I need to be around people. Where are my friends and my family? This woman has been relationally starved for more than a decade. And she's also spiritually empty. Because of her uncleanliness, she's not allowed to worship in the temple. She's not allowed to experience worship with her community, her church family. She's not allowed to go to the place where people went to worship the God of the universe. So she's removed not only from her religious community, all that she's known, she's also placed in this complete desperation that few of us will ever understand. Are we getting a glimpse of what her pain is like? We need to feel her desperation today. And in verse 26, she is so desperate to the point that she has spent every last dollar that she has to try and find a solution. Let me say it this way. She's invested everything she has in what the world had to offer. She tried medical doctors, she tried holistic doctors, she's exhausted every possible option that there is. And you know what? I don't judge her for that, because I think we all have a bit of a tendency, like she did, to think, how can I fix my problem? How do I fix my burden? Or put another way, what is it that the world has to offer me that can help me with this? But at the end of it, she finds herself broken and broke, incurable and out of hope. But then she hears about another option. Have a look at verse 27. It says, she had heard reports about Jesus, and she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his outer robe, for she thought, if I just touch his clothing, I will get well. I love that it says she had heard reports about Jesus, or in other translations it says after hearing about Jesus. Because that begs to ask the question, what is it that this woman has heard about Jesus Christ of Nazareth? Well, I'm going to suggest it's maybe the same things that Jairus had heard. Jairus, who had just come to Jesus to say, I need your help. pleading with him, "My daughter is dying." Perhaps she'd heard what we read in Mark chapter 1, where Jesus had healed Peter's mother-in-law. And then right after that, there's this revolving door of people who are coming to be healed in Capernaum. Maybe she hears what Mark records in chapter 2, where Jesus had healed the paralyzed man, or what he records in Mark chapter 3, where he healed the man with the withered hand. Maybe she's been hearing these stories, these reports all over the place, and she thinks, this man is my only hope. She would have been timid. She would have been physically weak. But she musters all of the energy she has to move through the crowd because she knew Jesus was worth the risk. And what exactly was that risk? Well, the risk was an unclean woman touching a clean man. And not just a clean man, but a rabbi. And not just a rabbi, but a clean rabbi that everyone wanted to be around. And not just that, but someone who claimed to be the Son of God. The risk was immense for her to put herself out there. But she realized he was her only hope. And so she gave up hope in the world to put everything on Jesus. And we really have to ask the same question this morning. If you're here today and you don't yet know Jesus personally, you have to ask the same question: is it worth risking in Jesus? Because he changes lives. But if the grace of Jesus is free, and it is, then the cost of following Jesus is immense. You have to give up your hope in the world in order to follow Jesus Christ. You have to give up the comforts to follow him. But the risk is worth it. And if you are here this morning and you are a follower of Jesus, the same question applies. Are you willing to risk? Are you willing to put yourself out there and truly follow and trust him, even with the burdens that you carry this morning? Have a look at verse 29. This happened as soon as she risked. It says, immediately her flow of blood was dried up, and she felt in her body and knew without any doubt that she was healed of her suffering. The response to her faith was instant, was straight away. The power of Jesus was immediate. And as soon as the woman realizes what happens, we see in verse 30 that Jesus also realized what happened. Immediately, Jesus, recognizing in himself that the power had gone out for him, turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who touched my clothes?" That's our question for today. And of course, the disciples are like, "Are you for real? Like, have a look around. The crowds are pressing in from all sides and you're asking, who touched me?" It's really a bit of a sarcastic reply, and it was probably in response to the fact that they had something really important to do. They were going to save a life. Not only were they going to save a life, they were going to save the life of a synagogue official, someone with power and wealth, someone of esteem. And they say, "Jesus, why are you bothering to ask this question? We don't have time for this silly question." They knew that entertaining this particular question is just going to make them later than they already were. I mean, surely the second person of the Trinity understands our timelines? Didn't the Son of God, the agent of creation, didn't he understand that they were on a mission that day to save Jairus' daughter, that they had somewhere important to be? And we kind of mock the disciples' response, but the truth is, I do this all the time. I'm like, God, if you just answered my prayer this way, this is my timeline, and surely it's going to work out better the way I'm suggesting. And you know what that does? That makes me God and not him. And I find it a little encouraging that the disciples had the same flaw that I and perhaps we do as well. See, the truth was Jesus, he could have actually just kept going that day. The healing had already happened. The woman had been healed. The work was done. But in his mind, there was something more important than the physical healing that needed to happen here. You see, he didn't want to just heal her. He wanted to establish personal relationship. And he wanted her to know some things. A woman for 12 years who hadn't been seen or known or loved, and he wanted her to know that he saw her, that he knew her, and that he loved her. And so he stops. And in the midst of the chaos, the God who leaves the 99 for the one stops on the way to a home of a wealthy and powerful man to find the lowly and the broken. Have a look at verse 32. He looked around to see the woman who had done this. And the Greek word there for looked around, it doesn't just mean he saw. It means he looked deeply within. In the midst of this crowd, Jesus isn't just glancing around to see who touched my clothes. He's in this space looking intently for the one person that he needed to minister to. She was the only priority for him. And she quickly realizes, I can't hide anymore. Verse 33, it says, the woman, though she was afraid and trembling, aware of what had happened to her, came and fell before him and told him the whole truth. Here is a woman standing before the God of the universe in fear and trembling. And actually, this is quite a common response when you understand the God that you stand before. The Greek word has this context of awe and wonder. This woman was amazed at who she was standing before because of what he had just done in her life. And so she falls down at his feet in this beautiful symbol of submission. And I want us just to see, just briefly, what she would have felt in that moment. The uncontrollable emotion, the release of her guilt and her shame, the embracing of her newfound freedom, the gratitude flowing from within her. First time in a very long time, she feels hope. And she's laying at Jesus' feet, no doubt crying and weeping as the thoughts of what this means for her race through her mind. And Jesus is now going to speak to her, and he's going to confirm to her everything that she had hoped for in him. Verse 34 says, he said to her, daughter, your faith, I love the way the Amplified says it, your personal trust, your confidence in me, your faith has restored you to health. Go in peace and be permanently healed from your suffering. Now, this one verse is packed with meaning, packed with importance, and we've got to see a few things here. Firstly, when he says daughter, this is the only time in all of the recorded Gospels that Jesus calls a woman daughter. I mean, talk about making this woman feel significant for so long, who had felt worthless after such a long time. In the midst of her pain, in the suffering, what he's saying to her is, welcome into the family of God. He's giving her value and worth. And then he goes on to say, your faith has restored you to health. Some translations say your faith has made you well, or your faith has made you whole. And Jesus uses this word sozo here. It's a word that's seen through the Gospels and the epistles. It's almost always, but not always, almost always tied to faith. And sozo not only has your faith made you physically well, but welcome into the family of God. This idea of salvation and being rescued. You are now made whole spiritually, Jesus says. Her healing has now gone beyond the physical, and it's going to go beyond that again, because the next statement he says is, go in peace. And the Greek word there is eirene. It's a Greek version of shalom. Eirene is almost identical to shalom. It means not just the freedom from an inward anxiety, not just the freedom from physical issues, but what it means is this peace, a wholeness, a completeness. So in this moment, he is saying, go and be complete. Go and be made whole. Go and be made new. This idea of shalom, because you are now brought into right relationship with God. He heals her physically, he heals her spiritually, and now he heals her emotionally and relationally. And then he finishes this statement by saying, be healed from your suffering. Some translations say your affliction. You see, the pain that she felt for 12 years was now gone for good. And that word affliction literally means the cause of your suffering. He says, go and be healed of the cause of your suffering, and makes her whole. He's saying you are no longer defined by this burden that society has deemed you to be an outcast. Take your place. This woman had risked everything on a God who had everything to give. And he brings about the most beautiful redemption and restoration of her whole life in every possible way. And when Jesus stops to ask this question, who touched my clothes? He intentionally carves out time out of this urgent itinerary, knowing that she's already healed, but wanting to stop and offer her dignity and emotional and relational restoration to a faith-filled woman that society had discarded. So let me ask you this question. Do you have the same faith in a Jesus who can meet you in your place of burden and pain right now? Because the truth is, the pain of this woman is very much alive in us, physically, emotionally, relationally, spiritually. We bear those same burdens. So my question is, do you have faith to trust God with your pain today? I'm sure many of you would be familiar with the name Nick Vujicic. Nick is an Australian-born motivational speaker. He's founded the ministry Life Without Limbs. He was born without arms and without legs. And he goes around the world, all around the world speaking. He's been invited into dictatorships. He's been invited into communist countries. He's been invited to prestigious events with kings and presidents. God has opened the most incredible doors through Nick's situation for him to share the gospel. And about 15 years ago, I had the opportunity to hear Nick speak. He was doing the rounds at a number of the Christian schools on the Gold Coast. And he came and spoke at a chapel service where I was teaching, the school I was teaching. And although it wasn't at this particular chapel service, he did tell the story of this one event where he asked the audience, he said, would it surprise you if I told you that in my closet I have a pair of shoes? And the room kind of goes silent. It's like, is this guy for real? He says, yeah, I've got a pair of shoes in my closet. And he goes on to say, I believe that we serve a God that is so great and so powerful that if he wanted to, if it was in his will, he could give me legs tomorrow. I could go to bed tonight and I could wake up in the morning with fully functioning legs for the first time, and so I have a pair of shoes in my closet in preparation for a miracle that God might do. The first kind of most obvious question is, well, how did you know what size shoes to buy? But maybe that's a little unimportant. But that aside, what incredible faith. What an inspirational man. You see, for Nick, I want you to hear this morning. The results of his faith were secondary to the faith itself. If you're taking any notes, I suggest you just write that one thing down. The results of his faith were secondary to the faith itself. Not that Nick didn't want to have arms and legs. He did, and he does. But what's more important is that every day he gets out of bed with faith in God, despite the fact that God hasn't granted him that miracle. And here's the disclaimer. Nick still doesn't have arms or legs, but he does still have the faith. And this really reminds me, and I'm going to close with this, of the story recorded in Daniel 3. King Nebuchadnezzar put this declaration out through the land. He said, everyone in my land is to bow down to me when the music plays. And there were 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and they said, no way, not us. We're not going to bow down. We will worship one true God. We're not going to bow down and worship you. And so Nebuchadnezzar arrests them and he throws them he says, I'm going to throw you into the fiery furnace. And they respond with this really incredible statement. They said, King, we believe our God is able. He's able to deliver us. But even if he doesn't, we will not worship your gods, because we worship the one true God who has a plan for our lives, who knows us better than what we know ourselves. And so we submit to that God. And we trust him even if he doesn't deliver us. How about us, church? Do we trust God with this faith? This same faith this morning, with the burden and the pain that we might carry? Do we trust God with the faith that would buy shoes even if we don't have feet? I want to give you an opportunity just in the quietness of the moment to offer your hardships to the Lord today. Your physical, your emotional, it might be relational, it might be spiritual. To offer those pains and those burdens to King Jesus, to talk to him about it, to declare to him this morning that your faith is in a God who is faithful, who is trustworthy. And then in a few moments, I'll close in prayer.